The year is 465 BCEI. In the heart of Persepolis, where columns rise like petrified giants and marble gleams under the desert sun, a wedding procession winds through corridors that smell of frankincense and power. But this is no ordinary marriage. The groom is Artaxerxes I, newly crowned King of Kings, ruler of an empire stretching from the first Indus to the Mediterranean. The bride is his half-sister Amytis. She is 14 years old. Her hands are painted with henna in intricate patterns that cannot hide their trembling. Around her neck hangs a gold collar so heavy it forces her chin up, making her look proud when she feels only terror. The priests chant in Old Persian, words about bloodlines and divine favor, about keeping the royal essence pure. What you're about to witness isn't just ancient history. First, a system of sexual control so calculated, so deeply woven into the fabric of power, that it survived for 2 centuries and influenced empires that came after. The practices of the Persian royal court weren't accidents of barbarism. They were policy justified by religion, protected by law, and enforced with absolute brutality. The question isn't whether these things happened. The evidence is carved into stone reliefs at Persepolis, recorded in Greek histories, and preserved in Persian royal archives. The question is whether you're ready to understand why. First, if you've ever wondered how power corrupts not just individuals but entire civilizations, you're in the right place. Here we examine the historical records that were deliberately mistranslated, the archaeological evidence that museums don't display, and the testimonies that survived despite attempts to erase them. Every view, every subscription helps us continue pulling these truths from the darkness where they were buried. Now let's return to that wedding, because what happens in the marriage chamber tonight will reveal the first truth about Persian royal sexuality. First was never about pleasure. First was about control. To understand the sexual practices of the Persian court, you must first understand the concept that justified everything. Ikfatvadatha, sacred incest. The Zoroastrian priests didn't just permit marriage between close relatives. They celebrated it as the highest form of purity. A Persian king who married his sister or daughter wasn't committing a crime. He was performing a religious duty. The logic was elegant and horrifying. The royal family carried the divine essence of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. To dilute that essence with common blood was sacrilege. Therefore, the closer the blood relation, the more pleasing to the gods. Artaxerxes first married not just his half-sister Amytis, but also, according to Greek historian Ctesias, who served at the Persian court, his own daughter Amestris when she reached marriageable age. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a king gone mad with power. This was policy, repeated across generations. Cambyses II married his sisters Atassa and Roxane. Darius II married his half-niece Parysatis. The practice was so normalized that when Greek ambassadors expressed shock, Persian nobles genuinely couldn't understand the objection. But here's what the official histories don't tell you. These marriages weren't just ceremonial. They were consummated, and the women had no choice. A Persian princess learned from childhood that her body belonged not to her, but to the preservation of the dynasty. Marriage to her father or brother wasn't a possibility she could refuse. It was a destiny carved into her flesh, the moment she was born female and royal. Greek physician Ctesias, who served at the Persian court for 17 years, recorded details that were so disturbing his own countrymen accused him of exaggeration. In his Persica, now preserved only in fragments and summaries, he described the wedding night practices of Persian royalty. The king's eunuch guards would prepare the bride, regardless of her age, in chambers decorated with scenes of fertility. If she resisted, She was drugged with wine mixed with herbs. If she screamed, the walls were thick enough that no one outside would hear. The morning after, she would be examined by the king's physicians to confirm consummation. This wasn't about protecting the bride's well-being. It was about ensuring the marriage was legally binding, and that any child born could be certified as legitimate royal offspring. The examination was recorded in palace archives. The girl's trauma was her private burden. But sacred incest was only the beginning. The Persian royal harem operated under rules that turned women into instruments of political control and men into guards who could never threaten the king's bloodline. Let's talk about the harem itself. The royal harem at Persepolis in Susa wasn't a pleasure palace. It was a prison dressed in silk. Archaeological evidence from Persepolis shows us the structure. High walls surrounded a complex of rooms, accessible only through a single gate guarded day and night. Inside lived the king's wives, his concubines, his daughters, his sisters, and sometimes his mother, all under the supervision of eunuchs. The eunuchs deserve special attention because they represent one of the most disturbing aspects of Persian sexual politics. The Achaemenid kings required castrated men to serve in the harem for one reason. A eunuch couldn't impregnate the royal women. But the process of creating eunuchs was deliberately brutal. According to Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, the Persians didn't just castrate slaves. They specifically targeted the most beautiful boys from conquered peoples. The operation was performed in childhood, before puberty, to ensure complete physical transformation. Greek and Egyptian medical texts describe the Persian method: total removal, both testicles and penis cauterized with hot oil. The survival rate was approximately 30%. Why such brutality? Because it sent a message. To conquered peoples, it demonstrated the totality of Persian domination. They would take your most beautiful sons and transform them into something neither male nor female, servants whose only purpose was to guard the women who continued the bloodline of their conquerors. It was emasculation as empire policy. But here's what breaks your heart. These eunuchs weren't just guards. They were confidants, administrators, and sometimes the only companions the imprisoned royal women had. Letters preserved on clay tablets from Persepolis, translated only in recent decades, reveal relationships between queens and their eunuch servants that were deeply affectionate. Not sexual, but profoundly intimate in a way that makes the tragedy complete. Both were prisoners. Both were bodies used by empire. The harem rules were absolute. No intact man except the king could enter. This created a bizarre situation that Greek observers found both fascinating and horrifying. The king's own sons, once they reached puberty, were forbidden from seeing their mothers or sisters. Xenophon records in his Cyropedia that Prince Cyrus the Younger didn't see his mother for 7 years after being sent to govern a province, because returning to the harem after puberty was forbidden. This policy had consequences that rippled through generations. Royal sons grew up separated from their mothers, raised by eunuchs and tutors, socialized into a world where women were simultaneously sacred and forbidden. Is it any wonder that their adult relationships with women were so deeply damaged? Now let's discuss what happened inside those walls when the king chose to visit. The selection process was ritualized humiliation. The king wouldn't simply choose a woman. He would send his chief eunuch to the harem with a royal signet. The eunuch would inspect the women, checking their appearance, their readiness, their health. Those deemed acceptable would be lined up. The eunuch would then report back to the king with descriptions. The woman selected would be bathed in milk, perfumed with oils imported from Arabia, dressed in robes designed to be removed easily, and taken to the king's chamber. She would wait, sometimes for hours, while the king finished other business. When he finally arrived, she would perform obeisance, forehead to the floor, until he gave permission to rise. What happened next is described in Persian royal correspondence with disturbing clinical detail. The king had absolute right to her body in any way he chose. If he was satisfied, she might be called again. If he was displeased, she might never see him again but would remain imprisoned in the harem for the rest of her life, forbidden from marrying anyone else because she had been royal property. Greek historians claim that some Persian kings had harems of more than 300 women. Most of these women would spend decades in luxurious imprisonment, waiting for a single night with a king who might never call for them. They couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children with anyone but a man who viewed them as interchangeable. But the cruelty went deeper still. Let's talk about the punishment for sexual transgression, because it reveals just how completely the Persian royal court controlled female sexuality through terror. If a royal woman was even suspected of adultery, the punishment wasn't just execution. It was annihilation of her entire existence. Plutarch records the case of a concubine of Artaxerxes II, who was accused of sleeping with one of the king's sons. The investigation was conducted by the king's eunuch guards, who had methods of extracting confessions that would be called torture today. When she confessed, likely under duress, her punishment was designed to serve as warning. She was taken to a public square in Persepolis, stripped naked before a crowd that included her own family, and tied to a wooden frame. But she wasn't executed immediately. According to Plutarch, she was kept alive for 3 days, displayed as an example, fed only enough to keep her conscious. Palace physicians monitored her condition to ensure she didn't die too quickly. Then came the final act. She was buried alive in a pit filled with stones, her face left exposed so that passers-by could see her slowly suffocate. The man accused with her, if he was noble, might be beheaded quickly. If he was a servant, he would be impaled. But the woman's punishment was always worse, more prolonged, more public, because her body was considered more guilty. She had allowed herself to be defiled. That was the unforgivable sin. This wasn't an isolated incident. Persian law, as recorded in the Avesta and described by Greek observers, prescribed escalating punishments for sexual crimes that depended entirely on gender and status. A nobleman who raped a slave girl might pay a fine. A slave who touched a royal woman would be flayed alive, his skin displayed in the palace as a warning. The records show that these punishments were carried out regularly. They were part of the system, not exceptions to it. Fear was how the Persian kings maintained control over thousands of women imprisoned in harems across the empire. Fear of exposure, fear of accusation, fear of punishment so horrible that even death would be preferable. But perhaps the most disturbing practice of the Persian court was what happened to royal daughters who couldn't be married to family members. When there were too many daughters and not enough brothers or uncles to maintain the bloodline, what did the Persian kings do with these princesses? They gave them to the temples. Greek and Persian sources both confirm this practice. Royal daughters who couldn't serve dynastic purposes through marriage were dedicated to temple service, but this wasn't the benign religious devotion you might imagine. Let's talk about what sacred prostitution meant in ancient Persia. Herodotus describes the practice at the Temple of Ishtar in Babylon, which was under Persian control. Every woman, regardless of rank, was required to sit in the temple precinct at least once in her life and offer herself to a stranger in exchange for money that would be donated to the temple. For common women, this might mean a single uncomfortable encounter. For royal women dedicated to permanent temple service, it meant something much worse. Recent archaeological work at temple sites in Susa and Persepolis has uncovered living quarters for temple priestesses that were essentially prison cells. Clay tablets record the names of women identified as royal blood serving the goddess. The tablets also record payments from men who visited them, supervised by temple eunuchs, with portions going to the temple treasury and the royal household. Think about what this means. A Persian princess, if she was unlucky enough to be unmarriageable within the family, could be sent to a temple where her body would be used by strangers, for profit, for the rest of her life, all sanctified as religious service. She would live in a cell, owned by the goddess but controlled by priests who answered to her father or brother, the king. She would never marry, never have children she could claim, never escape. And here's what makes it worse. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered an honor. These women were described as fortunate to serve the goddess in this way. Any resistance or complaint was treated as sacrilege. The priests could punish temple prostitutes who refused customers with beatings, starvation, or confinement in total darkness. The customer always came first. One clay tablet from Susa. One clay tablet from Susa. Dated to the reign of Darius I, records a complaint from a temple administrator that a royal priestess had become pregnant by a customer, and therefore could no longer serve effectively. The tablet notes that she was relocated to a different type of service. The nature of that service isn't specified, but other tablets from the same archive mention royal women working in temple mills, grinding grain until their hands were destroyed, a fate reserved for those who had somehow failed in their sacred sexual duties. The Persian royal court also practiced a form of sexual espionage that combined politics with pleasure in ways that destroyed countless lives. When Persian kings conquered new territories, they didn't just demand tribute in gold or soldiers. They demanded tribute in women. Beautiful daughters of conquered kings were required to be sent to the Persian court as concubines. This served multiple purposes. It humiliated the conquered rulers by making them complicit in the sexual exploitation of their own children. It provided hostages whose treatment could be used to ensure cooperation. And it created a network of information, because these women, once inside the harem, could be used to gather intelligence about their homelands and families. Greek historians record that Persian kings had concubines from every conquered nation. Artaxerxes II reportedly kept separate quarters for Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Bactrian women. These weren't just collections. They were political tools. A rebellion in a distant province could be punished by executing or torturing the women from that region held in the royal harem. An alliance could be sealed by treating certain concubines with special favor. The women trapped in this system understood their position. Some letters preserved on papyrus, written by Greek women held in Persian harems and smuggled out by sympathetic servants, described their situation with clarity. They knew they were hostages. They knew their treatment depended on politics beyond their control. They knew they might be killed on a whim if their homeland displeased the king. And they knew that no one would rescue them because their own families had sent them to this fate. But perhaps the darkest practice of all was what the Persians did with women captured in war. This wasn't about harems or temples. This was about terror as a weapon of conquest. When Persian armies conquered a city that had resisted, the treatment of captive women followed a pattern that was repeated across 2 centuries of expansion. The women of fighting age would be separated from the rest. Those considered beautiful would be marked for the royal harem, or for distribution to Persian nobles as rewards. The rest would be given to the army. But before that happened, they would be paraded through the streets of their conquered city, chained and naked, forced to walk past their destroyed homes and murdered families. Greek sources describe this as one of the Persians' favored tactics of psychological warfare. The survivors in a conquered city would see these parades and understand the price of resistance. The women in the parade would serve as living warnings. Resist us, and this is what happens to your daughters, your sisters, your mothers. After the parade, the women given to the army would be held in temporary camps. Greek mercenaries who served with Persian forces recorded what happened in these camps. The women would be distributed by lottery to the soldiers, with higher-ranking officers receiving first choice. The women would then travel with the army as slaves, expected to provide both labor and sexual service. Many didn't survive the first month. Those who did lived in a kind of mobile hell, property of soldiers who might sell them, trade them, kill them, or abandon them as the army moved. If they became pregnant, they would give birth on the march, or be left behind. Their children would be slaves from birth, property of whoever owned their mother. The Persian kings knew this happened. They approved it. It was part of how they maintained their massive empire with relatively small occupation forces. The threat of what would happen to the women if a city resisted was often enough to secure surrender without battle. Terror, particularly sexual terror against women, was empire policy. Now let's talk about the legacy of all this. The sexual practices of the Persian royal court didn't die with the Achaemenid dynasty, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BCE. He was horrified by some of what he found. Greek accounts describe his reaction to the harem at Persepolis. But then something interesting happened. Alexander began adopting Persian customs, including polygamy and the use of eunuchs. The practices that had seemed barbaric became tools of power too useful to abandon. The Seleucid dynasty that followed continued many Persian practices. The Parthians and Sassanids, later Persian dynasties, revived and elaborated on these traditions. Sacred incest continued among Zoroastrian nobility into the 7th century CE. The Islamic conquest ended some practices, but continued others, particularly the harem system and the use of eunuchs. Today, you can visit the ruins of Persepolis and see the carved reliefs showing processions of women bringing tribute to the king. Tourist guides describe them as celebrating the diversity of the empire. They don't mention that many of those women were being delivered into sexual slavery. The stones remember what the guidebooks forget. In museums, you can see the gold jewelry worn by Persian royal women. Beautiful craftsmanship. They don't display the letters describing how that jewelry felt around the necks of women who couldn't remove it, who wore it as marks of ownership. The historians who praise Achaemenid Persia for its tolerance and administrative sophistication rarely emphasize that this same civilization maintained one of the most sophisticated systems of sexual control in ancient history. Tolerance for diverse religions and languages coexisted with absolute intolerance for female autonomy or sexual choice. This matters today because we still live in a world where sexual control is used as a weapon of power, where women's bodies are treated as property, where rape is used in war as a deliberate tactic. The methods change, but the underlying truth remains. Those who control sexuality control society. The Persian kings understood this. They built their empire not just on military might, but on the systematic control of women's bodies and sexuality. They justified it with religion, enforced it with terror, and maintained it for centuries. And they left behind monuments celebrating their civilization while burying the testimony of those who suffered under it. But those testimonies survived anyway, in fragments of Greek histories, in clay tablets from temple archives, in letters written by women whose names we'll never know, in archaeological evidence from sites that museums prefer to leave unexplored. The stones speak if you know how to listen. You've just witnessed one of history's most calculated systems of sexual control. If this disturbs you, good, it should. These weren't primitive practices of an ignorant age. They were sophisticated policies of a civilization that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to do it anyway. If you want to understand how power really works, how civilizations maintain control, how sexual violence becomes policy, then subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the truths that were buried. Leave a comment telling us what shocked you most about the Persian royal court. And remember, the question isn't whether these things happened. The evidence is undeniable. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them. Because here's the final truth that breaks your heart. Every practice described in this video was legal, protected by law, justified by religion, and practiced by men who believed they were creating a perfect society. They weren't monsters. They were people. And that's the most disturbing lesson of all. These horrors weren't committed by villains. They were committed by human beings who built one of history's greatest civilizations while treating half their population as property. The ruins of Persepolis still stand, carved with images of power and glory. But beneath those stones, in graves we'll never find, lie the women whose bodies built that empire. Their silence echoes through the centuries. We owe them the truth.